In just 48 hours, a quiet sequence of moves inside the Sahel triggered alarm bells across NATO intelligence circles. No press conference, no official declaration, no dramatic speech broadcast on global media. Yet behind closed doors in Paris, Brussels, and Washington, emergency briefings were quietly convened, because what unfolded was not a single decision. It was a coordinated shift, and once it began, it could not be undone. This video breaks down exactly what happened during those 48 hours, why NATO failed to anticipate it, and why the Sahel is no longer playing by the old rules of global power. To understand why NATO was caught off guard, we need to look carefully at the sequence of events, not as isolated incidents, but as a chain reaction. Everything began quietly. Within a 48-hour window, 3 actions occurred across the Sahel region that, when viewed separately, seemed routine. But when analyzed together, they revealed a strategic coordination NATO had not prepared for. First, there was a sudden realignment of military communication channels between key Sahel states. Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger did not announce a new command structure publicly. Instead, existing bilateral defense communication systems were synchronized. This matters because NATO intelligence typically monitors new treaties, formal agreements, or public military drills. What they missed was the silent harmonization of operational protocols. Command language, logistics codes, and response timelines were aligned quietly, without the symbolic gestures that usually attract attention. Second, flight activity across the region shifted in a very specific way. Unannounced military transport flights were detected moving between Sahel capitals, but without the patterns normally associated with weapons transfers or troop deployments. These flights did not trigger immediate red flags because they appeared administrative. But intelligence analysts later realized they were moving something more valuable than hardware. They were moving coordination teams, small groups of officers, signal specialists, logistics planners, the type of personnel needed not to fight a battle, but to run one unified system. Third, and most critically, a previously fragmented early warning network was quietly integrated. Local radar systems, drone surveillance feeds, and border monitoring units began sharing data in real time across national lines. This is a major shift. For decades, NATO and its partners benefited from Africa's lack of integrated military intelligence. Fragmentation created dependency. Dependency created leverage. In 48 hours, that fragmentation began to dissolve. What NATO did not expect was the speed. Most Western military doctrines assume African regional integration moves slowly, delayed by politics, delayed by funding, delayed by bureaucracy. But this time, none of those delays occurred. Because the groundwork had already been laid. Training exchanges between Sahel states had been ongoing for months under the radar. Shared threat assessments were quietly circulated, long before the public ever heard of them. And leadership alignment, especially under Ibrahim Traoré, meant that once the signal was given, execution was immediate. This is why NATO intelligence reports later described the moment as a surprise, not because the move was impossible, but because it happened sooner than expected. The 48-hour window mattered because it removed NATO's ability to intervene early. There was no opportunity to apply diplomatic pressure, no time to issue warnings, no leverage to slow the process down. By the time analysts understood what was happening, the new coordination reality was already in place. And that is what truly unsettled NATO. Not a tank column, not a missile test, but the realization that Africa's Sahel state had crossed an invisible threshold. They moved from cooperation to integration. And once that line is crossed, reversing it becomes extraordinarily difficult. This was not a declaration of war. It was something more dangerous to external powers. It was a declaration of independence in military logic. To understand why NATO was so deeply unsettled by what happened in those 48 hours, we need to understand how NATO has traditionally viewed the Sahel. For decades, the Sahel was never treated as a strategic center of gravity. It was treated as a management problem. In NATO planning documents, the Sahel has consistently appeared under three categories: counter-terrorism, migration control, stability assistance. This framing is crucial, because when an entire region is viewed as a problem to be managed rather than a power to be negotiated with, intelligence priorities shift in dangerous ways. NATO did not monitor the Sahel as a future strategic actor. It monitored it as a security vacuum. That meant surveillance focused almost entirely on threats that moved outward. Jihadist networks, human trafficking routes, irregular migration flows toward Europe. What NATO did not prioritize was horizontal integration between African states themselves. In other words, NATO watched for enemies inside the Sahel, but it did not seriously watch for unity emerging from it. This blind spot shaped everything. When Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger expelled foreign military missions, NATO interpreted those decisions as political defiance, not strategic preparation. They were seen as emotional reactions, symbolic gestures, temporary disruptions that would eventually reverse under economic pressure. What NATO underestimated was leadership coherence. Under Ibrahim Traoré, Burkina Faso stopped behaving like a reactive state. It began behaving like a coordinating one. This distinction matters. Reactive states respond to pressure. Coordinating states anticipate it. NATO intelligence continued to assess Sahel militaries individually, country by country, capacity by capacity, budget by budget. But modern power does not emerge only from resources. It emerges from synchronization. And this is where NATO's analytical model failed. Their assessment frameworks assumed that without Western funding, African militaries would lose operational effectiveness. What they failed to account for was the efficiency gained by removing fragmentation. Three modest forces, once integrated, can outperform a larger but divided system. NATO planners assumed integration would require years of negotiation, institutional reform, and external facilitation. That assumption was based on European experience, but Sahel integration followed a different logic. It was threat-driven, it was leader-driven, and it was accelerated by exclusion. Once Sahel states were pushed outside Western security structures, they no longer had incentives to slow down for Western approval. This is why NATO's monitoring lagged behind reality. Their indicators were outdated. They tracked budget allocations. They tracked formal treaties. They tracked public military exercises. But the real transformation occurred through informal channels, shared doctrine workshops, joint threat simulations, quiet personnel exchanges. These are not events that trigger headlines, but they are the foundations of command unity. By the time NATO recognized the pattern, it was already operational. Internal assessments later described the situation as a loss of strategic visibility. That phrase is important. It does not mean NATO lacked information. It means NATO no longer understood how the information fit together. The Sahel stopped behaving in ways NATO's models were built to interpret. And when a system no longer fits your model, every decision becomes harder to predict. This is why NATO was not just surprised, it was destabilized, because surprise can be corrected. But a broken framework requires rebuilding from scratch, and rebuilding takes time. Time that the Sahel no longer intends to give. The reason NATO reacted with such unease is not because the Sahel suddenly became stronger in conventional terms. It is because the Sahel stopped playing the role NATO had assigned to it. For decades, NATO's military planning in Africa was built on one core assumption: that African forces would remain structurally dependent on foreign intelligence, dependent on external logistics, dependent on Western command frameworks. This dependency allowed NATO to operate from a position of indirect control. Even when Western troops withdrew, influence remained embedded in systems. What happened in those 48 hours challenged that foundation. The Sahel did not acquire new weapons that week. It did not suddenly expand troop numbers. What it did was far more disruptive. It altered the logic of how force is organized. NATO doctrine is built around centralized superiority, dominant air power, advanced surveillance, complex command hierarchies. This works well against fragmented opponents, but it becomes far less effective against decentralized but synchronized systems. The Sahel's shift introduced exactly that problem. Instead of relying on one central command vulnerable to disruption, coordination became distributed. Decision-making authority was shared across nodes. Information flowed horizontally instead of vertically. From a NATO perspective, this creates multiple complications. First, targeting becomes harder. When intelligence systems are integrated locally, NATO loses the ability to isolate blind spots. No single country can be pressured into cutting off data flows. No single base can be neutralized to paralyze operations. Second, response timing changes. NATO relies on escalation windows, moments when intervention can shape outcomes before local coordination solidifies. The 48-hour shift collapsed that window. By the time NATO could respond diplomatically or militarily, the new structure was already functioning. Third, deterrence loses clarity. Traditional deterrence depends on clear lines, clear red zones, clear consequences. But a coordinated Sahel does not present a single red line. It presents a moving network. Any action against one state now risks collective response. Even if that response is not kinetic, it can be logistical, diplomatic, or informational. This uncertainty is deeply destabilizing for NATO planners, because it removes predictability. And military planning without predictability is planning without confidence. Another critical factor is terrain. NATO power projection works best in environments where mobility, air superiority, and fixed infrastructure dominate. The Sahel offers none of these advantages consistently. Local coordination amplifies this asymmetry. Sahel forces do not need to match NATO technologically. They only need to deny NATO freedom of movement. By integrating early warning systems and local intelligence, the Sahel reduces NATO's ability to operate invisibly. And invisibility is essential to modern Western warfare. This is why internal military assessments began shifting tone. The language moved from control to containment, from engagement to risk management. That shift signals something important. It means NATO no longer sees the Sahel as an area it can shape freely. It sees it as a zone where miscalculation carries higher costs, and higher costs mean restraint. This is the strategic consequence NATO fears most, not confrontation, but loss of initiative. Once initiative is lost, power becomes reactive, and reactive power always arrives too late. What the Sahel demonstrated in those 48 hours was not strength in the traditional sense. It demonstrated maturity. The maturity to design security on its own terms, the maturity to anticipate interference, the maturity to move before permission is requested or denied. That is why NATO's calculations collapsed, because they were based on a version of Africa that no longer exists. To understand why the Sahel moved with such speed and discipline, one name cannot be avoided: Ibrahim Traoré. Not because he commands the largest army, not because Burkina Faso possesses superior weapons, but because Traoré represents a rare convergence of political authority, military legitimacy, and narrative control. Most leaders operate within existing structures. Traoré operates across them. His role in the 48-hour shift wasn't tactical in the narrow sense. He did not issue battlefield orders. He did not announce mobilizations. What he provided was something more powerful: alignment. In fragmented regions, power is often wasted managing internal contradictions, competing elites, conflicting loyalties, external dependencies pulling in opposite directions. Traoré reduced those contradictions. From the beginning of his leadership, he framed security not as a favor granted by external partners, but as a sovereign responsibility. That framing changed how decisions were justified internally. Once security is defined as sovereignty, hesitation becomes weakness. Delay becomes vulnerability. This mindset matters, because when the moment arrived to synchronize Sahel coordination, there was no internal debate about whether to move. The question was only how fast. Traoré's background as a military officer gave him credibility within the armed forces. But his political rhetoric gave him reach beyond them. He did not speak in technical jargon. He spoke in moral terms: responsibility, dignity, self-reliance. These concepts resonate deeply in societies that have experienced prolonged external control. As a result, decisions that might have faced resistance under a different leader were accepted as necessary. Equally important was Traoré's discipline. Many revolutionary figures rely on spectacle, public defiance, dramatic announcements. Traoré did the opposite. Silence was part of the strategy. No early leaks, no grandstanding, no signals for foreign intelligence to exploit. This restraint is what allowed the 48-hour window to close before NATO could react. Another key factor was trust. Coordination at this level requires confidence that partners will not hesitate under pressure, that they will not defect when incentives are offered, that they will not seek external validation. Traoré's consistent rejection of Western conditionality sent a clear signal to other Sahel leaders. There would be no reversal. Once committed, the path forward would not be negotiated back to its starting point. This credibility is rare. It is built not through promises, but through repeated refusals to compromise under pressure. That is why Traoré became a stabilizing force rather than a destabilizing one. Paradoxically, his firmness reduced uncertainty within the alliance. Everyone knew the direction. Everyone knew the cost of hesitation. Everyone knew the consequences of fragmentation. From NATO's perspective, this was deeply troubling, because systems can be pressured. Individuals with resolve are far harder to influence. Traoré did not need to coordinate every detail. He only needed to ensure that once coordination began, it would not stall. And that is exactly what happened. The Sahel did not move chaotically. It moved coherently. That coherence is what transformed a regional adjustment into a strategic rupture. And it is why external powers now view Traoré not merely as a leader of Burkina Faso, but as a catalyst for a broader African security logic. A logic that does not ask for permission. A logic that does not wait for approval. A logic that moves when the moment arrives. After those 48 hours, the most important question was not whether NATO would respond. It was how. Because some shifts cannot be reversed without cost, and others cannot be reversed at all. What the Sahel crossed was not a political line. It was a structural one. Once military coordination becomes integrated rather than cooperative, dismantling it requires internal fracture or external force. Neither option is simple. The first path would require Sahel states to lose trust in one another. That trust is now reinforced by shared risk. Each state understands that standing alone invites pressure. Standing together distributes it. This makes fragmentation less likely, not more. The second path would require external intervention, direct pressure, indirect destabilization, or prolonged containment. But all of these options carry escalating costs. Political costs in Europe, where public appetite for foreign entanglements is declining. Military costs in terrain, where superiority does not guarantee control. Reputational costs in a world increasingly skeptical of intervention narratives. This is why NATO's response so far has been cautious. Statements emphasize dialogue. Diplomatic language replaces military signaling. Silence fills the gaps where threats once existed. This restraint is not generosity. It is calculation. NATO understands that reacting too forcefully risks accelerating the very unity it seeks to prevent. At the same time, the Sahel understands that restraint is temporary. Pressure will return in different forms: economic leverage, information campaigns, attempts to isolate leadership figures. The difference now is preparedness. The 48-hour shift was not the end of a process. It was the beginning of a new phase. A phase where African security is designed internally, where coordination replaces dependency, where delay is no longer an option imposed from outside. This does not mean confrontation is inevitable, but it does mean negotiation dynamics have changed permanently. Africa is no longer negotiating from fragmentation. It is negotiating from alignment. That single change alters every future interaction. And this is what truly unsettles NATO. Not the possibility of conflict, but the certainty that the old formulas no longer work. The Sahel did not announce a revolution. It executed one quietly. In 48 hours, the balance of initiative shifted. And once initiative changes hands, history tends to follow. The question now is not whether the world will adjust to this new reality. It is how long it will pretend it has not already arrived. If this shift continues, the Sahel will no longer be treated as a problem to manage. It will be treated as a force to reckon with. And that changes everything. If you want to understand where Africa's security future is heading next, stay with this channel. Because what happened in 48 hours was only the opening move.